Cowboys 3H Eric Risberg, AP Dallas Cowboys head coach Jason Garrett gestures toward an official during the second half of an NFL football game against the Oakland Raiders in Oakland, California, Sunday, December 17, 2017. AP photo, Eric Risberg by SportsDayDFW.com at SportsDayDFW. SportsDay's Ballsy podcast hosts Kevin Sherrington and Barry Horn are joined by SportsDay's John Makota to discuss the Cowboys. Here are some of the highlights. Sherrington, let's move on to what we think the Cowboys' chances of beating Seattle are. John Makota, I think their chances of beating Seattle are great. Seattle looked terrible on Sunday, and the emotional lift from getting Zeke back. I can just tell you from being in that locker room after the game, as great as it was for them to be able to pull that game out and how excited they were to beat the Raiders, especially on the offensive side of that locker room, there was a lot of talk about Zeke coming back and what kind of impact he's going to have. So it's not just on the field. It certainly is emotionally for them what he brings. They know he's their most talented player. They can beat Seattle, but the problem is it might not matter if no one can beat Atlanta. Horn, can they be eliminated before they even take the field against Seattle? Makota, I know that they can't jump Atlanta, so I guess maybe there's still a chance if the Cowboys miss the playoffs. Is it because Ezekiel Elliott delayed his suspension? Sherrington, if Atlanta wins the division then I think they're with the Saints. Grant, if Atlanta wins out they're 11-5, and I think New Orleans and Carolina are both right now 10-4, so both of those teams would end up with at least 5 losses. So I don't know what the three-way tie protocol is at the top of the NFC South. Sherrington, there's still a possibility that Atlanta could win the division. That's what Cowboys fans should hope for at this point. I mean that game last night, if the kick sails through it goes into overtime. The kick is wide right and that was like the worst news for the Cowboys. Grant, I think the chances of the Falcons losing both games, losing at New Orleans which is 6-1 at home, and then losing at home, where they haven't played great, against a Carolina team that's certainly going to have something to play for, I think the chances of that are much greater than the possibility of the Falcons winning both. Horn, do you have Matt Ryan in your fantasy league like I do? He has my team single-handedly. They never can finish. Grant, I've talked to a lot of my buddies in Atlanta who last year were away by the MVP season, and this year feel like he's reverted back to what is a guy who tends to make bad decisions in big moments. He's made a lot of them this year. He has not been a very consistent quarterback. After the game last night that was a big talking point for ESPN, the lack of consistency the Falcons have shown, but be that as it may they still control this race. The Falcons play at noon. The Cowboys game is at 3:25 p.m. on Sunday. If Atlanta manages to beat New Orleans, then they'll have 10 wins and that would eliminate the Cowboys. Sherrington, John, if this team wins out, which is still a possibility they could win out, and I think the chances are getting better every day that they could end up 10-6, do you expect any changes in the coaching staff? Makota, I don't. I really don't. When they started the 3-game slide without Zeke, it was seeming like a real possibility. If they continued to suffer lopsided losses like that, as much as I think Jerry Jones loves having Jason Garrett as the head coach, I think his hand would have been forced. But I will say this, when there are those lopsided losses, it is very common for people to point to players quitting and mailing it in. I don't necessarily think that I've seen that. I don't believe I've seen that at all when Jason Garrett has been the head coach, that players are just quitting. On defense they're limited. There are certain guys that they're just not elite playmakers, so they're missing tackles in some of these games where people think they quit or mailed it in. I've never felt that about Jason Garrett's teams. You've certainly seen that across the NFL, college football, whatever. Players quitting on a coach, and I've never felt like that's happened. I've always thought if that did start showing, then you'd start seeing maybe Jerry go in another direction. But I don't see that happening at all. Plus if they win these last 2 games, they're going to be 10-6. Lastly, and maybe even the most important thing is, who really are the coaches out there you can go and get? There are times where you're heading into this part of the season where there are some big names that teams are talking about. They're really a great group of coaches someone's going to be going after. A big name that's going to you away. Horn, was Sean McVay a big name? Makota, he wasn't, but I don't think Jerry Jones looks at that as any different of a hire than already having Jason Garrett. Sherrington, people questioned that hire, and of course he's had a great year. Had a great impact on the Rams and Jared Goff's career. Makota, let's see this going forward. Nothing against Sean McVay, I think he's a great young coach. But there's something to be said for a guy that finished his first year showing a lot of things. The NFL is a league where a lot of these coaches have been in the league for a long time in different aspects of it. There's a lot about that, where you're coaching as long as Rod Marinelli and Jason Garrett. There's a lot of tape of what you like to do. When you're a new head coach like that, there's a lot of stuff that he's doing with the Rams that hasn't been seen before. There's a lot of talk about Dak Prescott. Once they see the tape, things are going to change and he won't have as much success. As great as Sean McVay is, I'm not ready to put him with the elite coaches in the NFL yet. He's going to have to do this for a few years, and allow teams to see what he does and see how they to respond to that. Cowboys CB Chidobe Awuzie reflects on 2 TDs allowed to Raiders WR Michael Crabtree. That's not going to happen again, Horn. My point was you don't always have to go for the Jeff Fishers of this world. There are a lot of young minds. Of course there's a lot of bad young minds, but there's a lot of great young minds out there as well, Sherrington. But the thing is, you know that now about Sean McVay, but you didn't know that Horn, but someone had enough faith in him to hire him, Sherrington. But for every Sean McVay there's a Josh McDaniels, Grant, who went to the playoffs in his first year, Sherrington. He did with Tim Tebow as his quarterback. But then it went right back to what you thought it'd be. Now he's considered, if there were a hot name, he's the one that people think that he'll get the next head coaching job just because he's been on Bill Belichick's staff.